Scientists actually started raising the alarm over potential climate change more than 50 years ago, but it's also been 30 years since James Hansen's well-known testimony, and it brings to mind this great quote, even if Albert Einstein didn't actually say it. Climate change has been part of the public conversation for 30 years, so it's important to ask how far we've come. We've seen the fingerprint of climate change evolve rapidly and unambiguously, including these 10 variables among many others. We've come to understand that the climate system is being forced at rates far exceeding anything that has happened naturally in the past, and that we should expect rates of climate change that far exceed anything in the geological record. We're increasingly recognizing that we face a series of bad outcomes when it comes to climate change, even if we suddenly start taking much more action on climate change, and if we're lucky and the climate system turns out to have a low level of sensitivity to rising greenhouse gas concentrations, we're probably looking at a best case of 2 to 3 degrees, which is not good news. And the worst case is potentially catastrophic. In parallel to better understanding climate change, we've made huge advances in understanding how we think about complicated problems, including climate change. The field of behavioral economics has fundamentally changed our understanding of human decision-making and behaviors over the last 20 years, and significantly changed our understanding of why a problem like climate change is so challenging to tackle. It turns out that humans are not living computers, and it turns out that we cannot be counted on to make the most appropriate personal or societal decisions on the basis of the best available information, no matter how much information we pile on. In fact, human decision-making is subject to all kinds of cognitive biases and other challenges that interfere with our decision-making, particularly when it comes to a problem like climate change. Margaret Heffernan's 2011 book, Willful Blindness, explores this aspect of human behavior, and her quote about climate change superbly summarizes the situation. The characteristics of climate change really do cause us individually and collectively to stick our heads in the sand when it comes to climate change. And it's not just those people often characterized as actual climate deniers. It's pretty much all of us at one time or another. What has been our most notable response to climate change for the last 30 years? More information. In effect, more climate storytelling. Whether we're talking about the problem of climate change itself, whether we're talking about the barriers to tackling climate change, or whether we're talking about potential ways to overcome those barriers and solve climate change, almost infinite information is just a click away at Amazon.com. Of course, it's much more than Amazon.com. A veritable climate information industry floods us with climate information on an almost daily basis through all kinds of channels. Put it all together and it becomes an overwhelming deluge. And the pressure isn't letting up. Even as scientists and researchers continue to produce massive amounts of new information, the public is being increasingly encouraged to get more involved in climate storytelling, although the purpose isn't always clear. A key question is whether the ever-growing flow of climate information and storytelling is helping to address climate change. We already know that it hasn't resulted in a policy response that would substantially mitigate climate change, or even one that has taken dangerous climate change off the table. But has the flood of climate information at least changed how we think about climate change? One answer may come from the work done since 2008 by Yale University's Project on Climate Communications to track the distribution of the so-called 6 Americas, illustrated in this cartoon. The answer seems to be no. There has been relatively little change in the distribution of the American public across the 6 Americas over the years, and the latest numbers reported in November 2016 are actually identical to the numbers for 2008, the first year of the survey. Simply throwing more and more information over the proverbial wall is not working to tackle climate change. But of course, behavioral economists have known for a while that such a strategy doesn't work. As suggested by the metaphorical Great Wall in this cartoon, more information doesn't necessarily translate into better climate change decision-making. There are too many intervening variables involved. Now, does that mean that climate information and storytelling can't influence how we think about and respond to a problem like climate change? Not at all. I was working with a Fortune 100 company whose leadership recognized the reality of climate change, but had never thought about it as a business issue. When this slide went up on the screen, several people around the room said, "Now I get it. Now I understand why we need to think about climate change as a business issue." This single slide helped them complete an internal story about how climate change might affect their supply chains, their distribution channels, among other things. It wasn't my storytelling that did the trick. It was providing them with a piece of information, a potential piece of a climate story that fit into their own internal climate change story development. As laid out in the book Influencer, what's happening here is that all human beings are asking themselves the same two questions before making virtually any decision. Is it worth it to me? And can I make a relevant difference to the outcome? So we're all looking for information that helps us answer these two questions. We're looking for actionable knowledge. As we accumulate actionable knowledge, we fit it into our internal storyline, and that influences our decision-making. It can also change our decisions. In the case of the Fortune 100 decision makers I was talking to, this graphic was actionable knowledge to them, and it helped them complete at least a part of an internal storyline on climate change. We've been throwing more and more climate information and stories at decision makers for the last 30 years. The good news is that information clearly exists to cause many decision makers to think differently about whether tackling climate change is worth it to them and what they can do about it. The bad news is that most of those decision makers never see that information. What if we took a different approach in the information wars and focused on making actionable knowledge more accessible to the decision makers that could use it? I'll explore this idea in part 3. It's a much more difficult strategy than we seem to be embarked on today, but at some point we need to question whether just producing more and more information and wringing our hands over climate change in action is really the path we want to go down.